John D Rockefeller was a very wealthy man. Compared to the other Golden Age tycoons, he certainly had the largest pile of money. He built the vast company known as Standard Oil, which for many years dominated the US oil industry. The question is, how did he start Standard Oil, and how did it get so large? Born in 1839, he was the oldest son of Bill and Eliza Rockefeller. While his father dabbled in many businesses, he relied mostly on being a traveling conman and snake oil salesman. Bill spent months at a time on the road, and it was never clear when or if he would be back. For Eliza and the children, while not exactly poor, money for expenses came erratically. This financial uncertainty caused the young Rockefeller to adopt a frugal mindset. He remained careful with money throughout his life, which came in very handy for his later business career. It was also reinforced by his religious views. John's mother was a devout Baptist who considered hard work and frugality a virtue. When John was 16, his father decided he shouldn't attend college. It turns out during his months away from home, being a conman wasn't the only thing he was doing. Bill had found himself a second, younger wife. With his oldest son able to earn a living, he was planning to cut ties with his family. At Bill's suggestion, the 16-year-old John took a 3-month course in business skills. This included double-entry bookkeeping and the basics of banking and commercial law. With this completed, he got a job at a small firm called Hewitt & Tuttle. He was now free of dependence on his unreliable father, and took over as chief breadwinner for the family. He worked long hours, examining invoices, paying bills, collecting outstanding debts, and constantly updating and analysing the accounting books. Hewitt & Tuttle were commission merchants and produce shippers, essentially buying, shipping and selling agricultural products on behalf of farmers. John lived in Cleveland, Ohio, which was a major transport hub at the time. Goods arrived from the Midwest, and from Cleveland could be shipped either by the Erie Canal or by rail to reach markets in eastern states. Essential to the business was learning about shipping costs and how to negotiate contracts. John would play shippers off against each other to get the lowest prices. These skills, and Cleveland's transport network, will be important again later. John excelled at this work, and after 3 years decided to branch out on his own. A friend of his, Morris Clark, proposed they start their own company. Rockefeller's frugality meant he had saved a large amount of his salary, and he scraped together the money. This new firm did well. Rockefeller was known as a hard-working, religious young merchant, and was trusted by older men in the community. His main problem was having enough cash to fill all the orders that flooded in. He borrowed thousands of dollars from banks and poured profits back into the business to increase cash reserves. Their business was also given a boost by the Civil War, which caused a boom in food prices. Now, you may be asking, shipping beans? I thought he was in the oil business. We are getting there. At the time, the best source of illumination was from whale oil, and unfortunately for the whales, a lot of them were needed. Whales were being pushed to extinction, which has the pesky side effect of pushing the price up. Alternatives were being investigated, and many existed, such as candles made from beef tallow and camphene. But these either burned with a dirty flame or were more flammable, which caused a fire risk. A better solution was needed. Oil was discovered in Titusville in 1859, and the first oil rush ensued. Thousands of people began to drill or refine oil to produce kerosene. In the early days, oil refining was tremendously profitable. All that was needed was a basic skill and a willingness to risk being set on fire. Rockefeller was introduced to the oil business by chemist Samuel Andrews. Their produce firm was printing money, so they chose to invest some of this in the new oil industry. In 1863, Andrews, Rockefeller and Clark banded together and built a refinery in downtown Cleveland. There were many oil refineries cropping up in Cleveland at the time, but none were as large or as profitable. John brought his accounting and cost-cutting skills to the new business and found savings everywhere. He made his own barrels for less than half the cost of buying them, drying the wood in the forest to cut on transport costs. They also burned the useless gasoline byproduct instead of pouring it into the lake like other refiners did. Within a year, their oil business was making more money than their produce business. Business was booming, but John and Clark were not getting along. Clark was 9 years older and behaved like he was in charge. They also had different ideas about the future of the oil industry. Rockefeller had faith that it would continue to expand, while Clark was more risk-averse. After one argument, Clark bluffed and threatened to break up the partnership. Rockefeller called him on this bluff and published in the paper the next morning that they were dissolving the firm. It turns out he had been waiting for this moment. He had secretly lined up financing with some receptive banks. The ownership went to an auction where John paid $72,500 for the refinery. That was in $1865 and would be more than $1 million today. In the same year, he brought his younger brother William into the business, and in December they built a second oil refinery. They were now the largest refiner in Cleveland, but there were still many smaller competing refineries in Cleveland and other hubs around the country. Cleveland had an advantage as a refining center, particularly compared to Pittsburgh, the main competitor. This advantage was a far better transportation network. Cleveland had 3 competing railways, as well as the Erie Canal, that they could use to ship oil and other required supplies. Pittsburgh only had the one, who had a stranglehold on the Pittsburgh refiners. Rockefeller brought his negotiation skills to the table and again fought aggressive bidding wars between these railroads, something Pittsburgh refiners couldn't do. They could also offer the railroads other incentives. Railroads preferred large, regular shipments of oil. This simplified logistics and meant the railroads needed fewer expensive tank cars. Standard Oil organized huge volumes of refined oil to be shipped reliably every day, including from other refiners, in exchange for low prices. This lowered costs for both the railroads and Standard Oil. Was it a good thing that large refiners got much lower prices than small ones? On one hand, bulk shipments did legitimately lower costs for everyone concerned, including the consumer, but in other ways it was kind of unfair. It's important to put this argument into context. Railroads had far more economic power than they do today. At the time, if you wanted to ship an item a long distance over land, the choice was shipping items via railroad or putting it on a horse-drawn wagon, a method of transport that hadn't changed much since the Middle Ages. Obviously, for long-distance, railroads were the only viable option. Railroads also tended to be natural monopolies, which means that once a town or city has one railroad, there is very little economic incentive for a competitor to build into the same area. Therefore, most towns or small cities only had one. This meant for businesses that relied on long-distance transport, they ended up using the same railway networks as their competitors. For large companies to receive discounts simply due to their size was unfair, as it would naturally drive small companies out of business. Eventually, laws were introduced to regulate long-distance shipments and forced railways to charge everyone the same amount, but these weren't in place at the time. By the late 1860s, there were huge amounts of overcapacity in the oil refining industry. Demand for kerosene was healthy, but simply too many people had rushed into the oil business. Prices trended downwards, and many refiners went out of business. Standard Oil continued to make money, but their profit margins were slimmer than they had been. Standard secretly worked with the railroads and a small handful of other refiners to lower shipping costs. They agreed to split their oil shipments between the 3 railroads at fixed percentages. This saved the railroads from the savage price wars Rockefeller had previously waged. In exchange, the oil refiners were given low prices that were only available to members of the group. This was organized using a new shell company called the South Improvement Company. Many refiners and railroad executives had shares, but it was controlled by Standard Oil. This deal never actually came to fruition. The details leaked out and there was a huge uproar. Other refiners were obviously furious, and angry mobs formed outside Standard Oil properties. The railroads eventually bowed to public pressure and backed out of the deal. But the news had done enough. This deal scared the daylights out of competing refiners. They knew that Standard Oil had an advantage, and it would only be a matter of time until one of their schemes paid off. Over a 2-month period, Standard Oil purchased 22 of the 26 Cleveland refiners. Competitors were threatened that they should join Standard Oil or be driven out of business. This was later called the Cleveland Massacre. Some refiners were shown the accounting ledgers, and either impressed or frightened by how profitable they were, agreed to sell out. Many of the owners were given stock, and some joined the company as managers. Giving stock instead of cash was preferred, as it gave everyone an incentive for Standard Oil to succeed. The oil glut continued, so Standard was buying most of these plants to shut them down. They weren't willing to pay the best prices, typically a little more than scrap value. This left many refiners with a lot of hard feelings. A few Cleveland refiners refused to sell, and were eventually driven into bankruptcy. After taking over Cleveland, Standard kept up the momentum and moved on the other refining centers. One by one, it brought out competing refineries, often keeping the ownership deals secret. Every new refinery increased their market power and made subsequent deals easier. By 1880, Standard refined 90% of the oil produced in the United States. Very quickly, they had gone from having a slight advantage amongst a crowded field to controlling the industry. Having crushed refiners, they moved to consolidate other parts of the oil business. Long-distance pipelines were demonstrated to be technically viable, and Standard began to develop a national pipeline network. This eventually became quite substantial, and meant that they no longer needed the railroads to ship oil. They also built into the oil fields. This replaced the teams of independent haulers that used to transport oil from the wellhead to the pipeline or railroad terminal. When drillers would strike oil, Standard would arrive and offer to connect them free of charge, although there were of course nefarious strings attached to this arrangement. Standard didn't just pipe and refine the oil, they also sold it directly to consumers and managed a large retail network. To keep a stranglehold on competition, they would engage in predatory pricing. If a new competitor popped up, Standard would cut prices in the local area and raise prices elsewhere to compensate, driving the upstart out of business. Whatever your opinion on the railroad's behaviour, this was definitely an unfair advantage. They also bullied retailers to only sell their product. If they wanted to pressure a shop, they would go door to door, selling straight to the customers, undercutting their own supply network. Eventually, a store would relent and agree to only stock Standard Oil. This ended a lot like the board game Monopoly. By building a hotel on Mayfair, by controlling the refining industry, Standard Oil made a lot of money. So, was it all smooth sailing from here on out? Well, yes and no. From a business perspective, Standard Oil had vanquished their rivals, at least for the time being. But they had also made a lot of enemies along the way. The real threat to Standard now moved into the political realm, where public outcry stoked attacks on Standard at a state and federal level. This eventually threatened Standard Oil's very existence, but somehow this made Rockefeller richer than he had ever been. To find out how, please tune in for part 2.